Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're doing a deep dive into something pretty intense. We've got source material that's, well, let's just say it's heavily charged, politically and financially. It's predicting not just a downturn, but a total imminent collapse of the current socioeconomic order.
Yeah, it's dense stuff and quite volatile. Our job today really isn't to endorse it, but to unpack it, to try and structure this web of collapse theories. It's easy to get lost. We'll focus on what the source sees as the core, the economic side, specifically the dollar, and then look at the resistance tactics it proposes.
And just to set the stage, this isn't your standard recession warning. The source is talking about something bigger than the 1929 crash and the 1933 bond crash combined. And critically, it's not just a U.S. thing. The claim is this hits all Western liberal republics, the ones built on that petro-dollar system after World War II.
Exactly. The stakes are set incredibly high from the get-go. So maybe let's start with the historical parallel they use. It sort of frames the whole argument.
Okay, yeah. The Soviet parallel. That's the first big comparison. The source essentially views the U.S. right now as a collapsing American empire, much like the Soviet Union under Gorbachev.
And it's interesting because they add a nuance there. They don't think the U.S. will physically, break apart like the USSR did, not into separate countries. But they do think the recovery timeline will be similar. They point to Russia taking, 20 years? A full 2 decades to really recover from the Soviet collapse, stabilize its economy, and rebuild internally.
20 years. That's a long time for isolation and rebuilding. Does the source give specific reasons why it'll take that long for the U.S.? What are the indicators?
Well, according to them, it's the sheer depth of the financial mess, which leads us right into their central point, the dying dollar. They are absolutely convinced the whole thing hinges on the degradation of the currency. They state it pretty bluntly. The petro-dollar is dead, and its corpse is falling.
Okay, maybe a quick refresher for anyone listening. The petrodollar system.
Right.
What is that exactly, and why is it supposed to death such a huge threat, especially to these Western countries?
Sure. So in simple terms, it's the agreement from the 70s that oil worldwide is mostly bought and sold using U.S. dollars. This created this huge, constant global demand for dollars, propping up its value. The source claims that demand, the bedrock of the currency's strength, is crumbling now because of staggering U.S. debt. They point to the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, saying it's basically all debt, no real assets backing the system anymore, makes the whole structure super vulnerable,
Right. So the debt itself becomes the weapon, and the lack of hard assets means there's no safety net. But it's not just the internal debt, is it? The source also predicts an external shock coming soon, an energy crisis this fall.
Yeah, that's presented as the immediate trigger, the catalyst that starts the dominoes falling politically and financially. And they use Germany as a key example, that decision to shut down their nuclear plants. The source calls it a massive, destabilizing error.
And the predicted result of Germany doing that?
Well, the immediate effect, they claim, is Germany having to import energy at vastly higher prices, maybe 40, 50, even 70% more per kilowatt hour from places like France or Finland. The analysis is that this economic pain will be so acute, the German government itself will collapse. They draw a direct line to the situation they also predict for South Africa's government, collapsing over its own electricity problems. The core idea being people get really unhappy when the lights go out.
And that unhappiness turns into political chaos.
Exactly. Lack of power literally leads to a collapse of political power.
Okay, so the collapse starts with energy, economics. But then the source shifts hard into social and political breakdown. What kind of evidence or claims do they use to back up this idea that the political system is at peak insanity?
It pivots pretty fast into cultural issues, yeah. Starting with climate change narratives, the document shows this deep skepticism towards mainstream climate concerns. The authors actually call it a religion.
And they cite some specific data points, though the definitions seem a bit loose.
They do. There's mention of a European survey, and yeah, we should note their definition of adult in that survey was anyone 13 or older, which is unusual. But anyway, this survey supposedly showed 61% saying there was no basis at all for a climate crisis. Plus, they point to a German referendum on climate engineering that apparently failed spectacularly, like 82% voting against it.
Yeah.
They see this as proof of widespread disbelief.
And this alleged rejection of climate policy then feeds into their really stark assessment of the government itself. And again, just a reminder, we're reporting the source's language here, which is highly polarized. They call the current situation peak insanity. And they specifically claim the Democratic Party has been taken over by what they term the Communist Party.
Precisely. The source claims this political shift is the root cause of the breakdown. But they also suggest there's internal pushback happening already. They mention moderate Democrats peeling away, becoming Republicans because of this perceived extremism. So resistance is building, in their view.
This political narrative then connects directly to institutions failing. Right, specifically the justice system. They argue the courts are captured. They allege prosecutors, supposedly backed by George Soros, are deliberately misusing charges like aggravated assault against people acting in self-defense, particularly in blue states.
And that claim of capture goes right down to the jury selection process. The source argues that juries aren't composed of your peers in the constitutional sense anymore. Instead, they say selection is based on jury diversity, meaning prioritizing certain racial groups.
So if the courts are compromised, according to the source, who is enforcing this agenda on the ground?
Well, they use pretty inflammatory terms here. They claim certain political opponents act as the enforcing arm, even calling them brown shirts for the alleged communists in America. And they make the specific claim that police are sometimes told to stand down, allowing violence against those who disagree with this agenda. It paints a picture of, well, a state apparatus turned against its own citizens.
Wow. Okay, so given that backdrop, alleged political capture, imminent financial doom.
Right.
The source then gets very specific about what individuals should do. Strategies for defense, but also for SAS fighting back against the legal system itself.
Yeah, they frame this current period, maybe the next 12 months or so, as the most dangerous phase. And the defense planning isn't just about safety. It's heavily focused on navigating what they see as a hostile legal environment afterwards, minimizing repercussions.
And the strategy involves escalating defense measures carefully.
Right. Based on the threat level. Start relatively low, maybe a cane, then perhaps a taser, though they do warn tasers aren't great in sudden, close-up ambushes. Then only if the threat becomes truly life-threatening, potentially a knife or a pistol. But the really unique part of their tactical advice is about weaponizing victim status. If you have to use force in self-defense, the source advises causing significant damage to the attacker, enough to make a statement. And then, essentially, dare the courts to prosecute you. The goal is to seize the victim narrative back, which they argue is the main political tool used against them.
So it's not just defending yourself physically, it's immediately going on the offensive legally and politically. And this counterattack extends further, right? If a prosecutor does charge you for self-defense, they recommend suing the prosecutor back for malfeasance.
Exactly, a very aggressive move. Malfeasance means, like, official misconduct. The source claims that even if that countersuit doesn't ultimately win, it throws a wrench into the works. It derails the original case against you. It forces extra procedures, creates chaos, basically bogs down the system they believe is pushing this communist agenda. The speaker even mentions a personal case where they supposedly won by using procedural tactics against the court's own interests.
That's fascinating, using the system's own rules against itself as a political tactic. But the source suggests this legal maneuvering is only possible for a limited time, while the system, the dollar, still has some function.
That's the idea. This period of tuned law is temporary. Soon, they predict, the collapse deepens to a point where nobody will be willing to listen to official orders. Police won't get paid reliably, or they won't be willing to make arrests in the chaos. That lack of enforcement is the tipping point into what they call a brief period of lawlessness. Something like the Wild West, once the dollar degrades so much the state can't pay its enforcers.
Okay, so if total collapse is coming, what's the bigger plan? Beyond individual survival, how does the source propose actually changing the system? This leads to the end the Fed idea, doesn't it?
It does, and this strategy relies on a very specific, and you might say conspiratorial, prediction. The source claims that major international bodies, the IMF and the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, which kind of oversees central banks, have a secret plan. Allegedly, they plan to deliberately crash the stock and bond markets the day after Republicans vote against raising the debt ceiling. They see this as a desperate final move by the opposition.
And the source sees this potential crash not as a disaster, but as a strategic opening.
Exactly. The counter-move is to preemptively expose this supposed plan, publicly announce, we know what you're planning, and declare that the immediate public reaction will be a massive wave of outrage demanding one thing, and the Fed, abolish the Federal Reserve.
What's the leverage point there? Why would demanding end the Fed work at that specific moment of crisis?
The leverage, according to the source, is that a crash of that magnitude would wipe out 401ks, potentially Social Security. At that point, the Federal Reserve becomes useless, even harmful to the average person. Its political protection evaporates. The aim is to terrify the opposition, disrupt their alleged plan, and crucially, educate the normies, their term, to dump dollars and buy hard assets like gold, silver, crypto, accelerate the de-dollarization.
And the practical method for this fight is social media.
Primarily, yes. End the Fed trending before the predicted crash. Make it a daily chant online, especially on platforms like Twitter. So when or if the market tanks, the narrative is already primed. The Fed did this, let's get rid of it. Looking past that immediate battle, the source paints a picture of the long-term rebuilding, and it involves America fundamentally changing its global role. The idea is the U.S. sheds its external territories and commitments, places like Guam, the Philippines, maybe even Taiwan. It isolates itself, like they claim Russia did during its 20-year recovery.
And a major casualty of this isolation, in their view, is the United Nations.
Yeah, they make a striking claim there that the U.S. funds something like 90% of the UN's operating costs, buildings, staff, everything. So once the dollar collapses and the U.S. stops paying those bills, the UN just fades away quickly. The long view, 20 years down the line, is optimistic in their framework. A kick-ass country is the phrase used, one that has shed what they see as globalist burdens imposed since the 40s and 50s, and importantly, refuses to rebuild that kind of American empire. The collapse is framed as a necessary purge.
All right, so let's bring it back to the immediate advice for you listening. If you take this source seriously, the actionable steps are stark, aren't they? It boils down to get your fuel, get your food, get ammo, get precious metals, get cryptos. Secure your basics, protect yourself and your assets, and socially, get a community around you. Build local resilience.
Yeah, and the fundamental economic shift they insist on is demanding real value. After the collapse, the rebuilt U.S. won't trade in fake money from central banks anymore. It will demand real goods in exchange for whatever it offers. That shift from currency dependence to tangible goods is the measure of success in this envisioned future.
Which brings us to our final thought for you today, something to really mull over. Let's say this scenario plays out. The U.S. does shed its global empire, pulls back, focuses inward, and starts demanding actual goods instead of relying on the dollar's global status. What are the immediate radical ripple effects globally? Think about the vacuum left behind when those dollar-backed international systems, trade, security, diplomacy, suddenly evaporate. What rushes in to fill that space?
It's a huge question, definitely a deep dive for you to consider on your own, lots to think about there.